Courtney Stephens, owner and founder of QED Energy Associates, where we make the world's best reservoir engineering technicians. I'm excited to be here with you today for PHDwin Week 2025. Big thank you to John Smith and the whole team at TRC for putting together an excellent PHDwin Week conference again this year. We truly appreciate you guys. I am here today to talk to you about scenarios in PHDwin version 3. Now, how I tend to teach is I tend to break things down into very simple parts. So please excuse me if you feel like this example is way too simple. But I'm going to do a simple example to show how we might utilize scenarios and qualifiers in PHDwin version 3. Well, lots of times when I'm running a database, I want to check how sensitive my database results are to different price decks. What if we had a flat price deck of $100 per barrel for oil and $5 per MMBTU for gas? The results would certainly be different if we brought that down a bit to maybe 90 and 450, or if we took it all the way down to 80 and 4. There would be lots of different price decks we could test. If we tested something like $50 per barrel and $2.50 per MMBTU, we would probably get, definitely less recoverable hydrocarbons in our reserve report answers. Again, I might want to test whenever I'm running my database in PHDwin version 3, different operating expenses. Certainly I'm going to do my best to go through the lease operating statements and come up with some reasonable fixed and variable operating costs associated with each of my assets. But, maybe I'd want to test how sensitive, or how different operating expenses would affect the results of my file. So I put some, pretty simple examples here. We could try $12,000 per well per month and 20 cents per MCF, or, we could kind of drop that and try what if wells cost $10,000 per well per month with 18 cents per MCF for gas. And I've kind of given us lots of options to look at here. My question for you is, what if we needed to put together a best case scenario? So I'm going to ask you to pick which price deck and which expenses setup we would use if we were going to put together a best case scenario for our wells that are in our database. All right, which price deck would you choose if you're putting together a best case scenario? That's right, you'd choose the highest one. $100 for oil, $5 for gas. That sounds good. Likewise, we're putting together a best case scenario. What would you choose for your expenses? Oh, you got it. We'd choose the lowest, $2,000 per well per month and only 10 cents per MCF on those variable OPEX for gas. That makes sense for a best case scenario. Now let's do the opposite. Let's do worst case scenario. What would you choose to be the price deck? Okay, you'd choose that flat $50 a barrel and $2.50 for gas because that's the lowest out of all the options that I threw up here. And for these options here, what would you choose for a worst case scenario? You've got it. You'd choose the highest. You would choose the $12,000 per well per month and the 20 cents per MCF for gas. Well, that makes sense. So when we're putting things into PHDwin, we're really putting them in under a qualifier. So every time you're putting something into PHDwin version 3, it's getting a qualifier or a word attached to it. So if I was going to put in this particular price deck, I would put that in, and we're going to do this here in a minute, under the qualifier high. And if I was going to put in this other price deck, I would put that in under the qualifier low. Likewise, and we're going to do this here in a minute, I would put in these operating expenses under the word high, and I would put in these operating expenses under the word low. Now those are called qualifiers, and every input that we input into a PHDwin V3 database has a qualifier associated with it. A scenario is a grouping of qualifiers. So for our best case scenario, we would want price inputs that were qualified as high and expense inputs that were qualified as low. But for our worst case scenario, which we're going to set up, we would want our price inputs that were qualified as low, but our expense inputs qualified as high. A scenario is a grouping of qualifiers. When you set up a scenario in PHDwin version 3, you're actually picking the qualifier for each of these sections of inputs. So the inputs that you're putting into a PHDwin V3 database are divided into expenses, fiscal models, investments, ownership, prices, PRMS, projections, and shrink. And you get to choose for each scenario that you set up which qualifiers that represent inputs you want to be run for the outputs for that scenario. Now let's look at this in PHDwin version 3. I've got a database set up with just one case here called test well 1. Now remember, whenever you are on the home ribbon up here on your tab, if your screen doesn't look like mine, remember to change the view. Whenever you open a PHDwin database, if it looks pretty blank, it might be in the blank view. So remember, on the home ribbon in PHDwin version 3, you can always hit the drop down and select a view. I personally like the A&D view. That gives me a production plot, some input information, some well information, and historical production data. But you can set up your own custom views as well. When you're on the Home tab, we have this drop down right here where it says Scenario. And I've already set up for us a best case and a worst case scenario. So let me show you really quickly how I set up these best and worst case scenarios for us. I went to Database Settings and I clicked Scenarios. Now when you entered this menu, you can't make any changes unless you click Edit. So I did that. You can add any scenarios that you want here. You can copy. I'm going to show you that soon. And then on the Qualifiers tab, this is where you can choose for each of your scenarios which qualifiers are going to be utilized for each section. So for example, I have a default database where all inputs that I was putting into this database were being qualified as default. But now that I've made a best case scenario, I've also established two qualifiers called high and low. And you can add qualifiers really easy. You just add this plus, and I'll put one called test, and now that'll be on the list. So you can add as many qualifiers as you want. I would recommend using alphanumeric strings. I'd start with letters, not with numbers, but that's just my personal preference. And so then you can drag and drop, as is the nature of PHDwin, to utilize different qualifiers for your particular scenario. So right now I'm in this best case scenario, and I've dragged and dropped the word low to be my qualifier for expenses. And then I've dragged and dropped the word high to be my qualifier for prices. Same thing on the worst case scenario, and I'll scroll to that. I dragged and dropped the word high to be my qualifier on the word expenses, and I dragged and dropped the word low to be my qualifier on prices. Now I'm going to click save, and we're going to get out of this particular menu. We do need to exit edit mode because we were editing scenarios, so I'll click that button right here, just a single left mouse click. And what I'd like you to know is that when you're in a scenario, every change you make is changing according to that scenario. So I'm going to go back to the Home tab, and right now we're in the best case scenario. So if I add a price to this single case, it's going to add that price and give it the qualifier for this scenario, which for best case scenario, we gave it the word high for prices. So let's go ahead and put in an oil price and a gas price. So I'm going to drag and drop oil over here. My high price was going to be $100 a barrel. I'm going to drag and drop gas. My high gas price was going to be $5 per MCF. I think I can double click and change that to, I feel like I could change that to per MMBTU, but I actually don't have a BTU factor in here, so I'm not going to worry about that right now. Now, when we're on the best case scenario, whenever we're entering expenses, those are going to save to the word low. So let's go ahead and enter our fixed OPEX, which is going to be $2,000 per well per month. That does sound low. And then we needed to put in gas OPEX, which is a variable OPEX of only 10 cents per MCF. So whenever I'm saving these inputs to this case, because I'm on the best case scenario, I'm saving those inputs to the qualifiers associated with this scenario for each section. Let's flip now over to the worst case scenario. Okay, when we're in the worst case scenario, we'll see that there are no expenses because we haven't put any on yet. But we know when we add expenses to this worst case scenario, it's going to save under that qualifier that we specified, which happened to be high. So I'll drag and drop over the fixed cost, which in this case was going to be $12,000 per well per month. And then I'll drag and drop over the OPEX, which is going to be 20 cents per MCF. Then let's flip over to prices. Again, when we establish prices, when we're on the worst case scenario, it's going to save to the qualifiers low for prices because that's what we specified within the scenario. So for oil price, we were going to have $50 per barrel, and for gas price, we were going to have $2.50 per MMBTU, and I'm not going to worry about changing that right now because I don't actually have any BTU factors. So we've just done a very quick, very simple example of how we could utilize qualifiers and scenarios. First of all, anytime you enter a database, the first thing you need to do is set up your scenario and make sure you're selected on the correct scenario. Just like in the old PHDwin V2, one of the first things you did was choose the partnership that was correct. I would always go to like File Partners back in V2 and make sure I was on the right partnership. First things first, when you open a V3 database, choose the scenario that you need to be on or set up a new scenario. Scenario should just be the first thing you think of when you open a V3 database. The reason that's important is because when you're using PHDwin V3, every change you're making, every input you're putting into the database is actually saving to a qualifier, and that qualifier is according to whatever we set in the scenario. Now, how do we get back to those scenarios again? On the Database Settings tab, you can just click Scenarios. Remember, you can view things, but you can't change anything unless you hit the Edit button here. So if you wanted to view, you could look at how things are currently qualified, but if you wanted to make any changes, we would need to hit Edit. For right now, I'm just going to hit Close. Now to look at another application of scenarios and qualifiers, let's change databases. I'm in a database right now that just has this test well. I'm going to change over to a database that Aaron and Frankie and I were working for PHDwin Week. So this is a PHDwin Week import database that my whole executive team, other than Ashley, was working on. So it was Frankie Delgado was working on it, Aaron Randolph was working on it, and I am now going to work on this database. So here's kind of the mentality of how we would use scenarios when we are sitting down at a database. When Frankie gets in the database, he has set up a scenario called FD, which are his initials, and he has chosen for all forecasts to save to a qualifier that are his initials. So as he's going through and reforecasting, putting new projections, adjusting the decline curves case by case by case, every time it's saving, he's got a qualifier for projections called FD. Within his scenario, the FD scenario. Now, Aaron is not just working technical stuff on our team. Aaron Randolph is also our lead trainer. So Aaron didn't have as much time this week to go through and reforecast all the wells in the database. Instead, she put an 80-20 sort on the database, and she only had time to go through and reforecast the wells that represented the top 80% of the value, which, as usual, were in the top. It was only like 20% of the cases held 80% of the value. So Aaron established a scenario called the ER scenario, which is her initials. And just on those cases, just those few cases that she was going to focus on because her time was limited, she put a new forecast on. She adjusted the ARPS equations. She changed the decline curve parameters for the forecasts. And her qualifier for projections is her initials, ER. And so every adjustment Erin made got saved under her initials, but she didn't change every case. She just changed those top 20% of the value cases. Now, while I'm live with you guys, she did point out that I needed to go back and look at the Aldrich L6. She said that it looked like maybe there'd been some recent work done. She wasn't sure, but she wanted me, the boss, to go back and just make a check on that one guy. And so I might look at the Aldrich L6, and any changes I would make, I'm going to make under my own scenario. So let's together go ahead and set up a scenario just for me. When we want to mess with scenarios, we're going to go to database settings and we're going to click scenarios. This menu is going to open up, but we can't make any changes unless we click edit. Now I'm going to add a new scenario, so I'll click the add button and I'm going to call it my initials, which are CS. And then in qualifiers, I'll go ahead and establish a new qualifier called CS. And in my scenario, I'll drag and drop that qualifier over so that for projections, any changes made to projections, if I'm within that scenario, are going to be under CS. As a final step, I need to put all the cases in my scenario. So do remember to go to the case selection tab, hit the drop down for that new scenario that you're setting up, and drag and drop over the cases that you'd like to show up in your scenario. We almost always drag and drop all cases, but you could do a subset if you wanted to. So now that I've saved that, I'm going to exit edit mode. And then back on the home tab, I'm going to choose CS, which is now my scenario. So any changes that are currently being made are being saved to my initials. All right, well, I'm not loving this 5% minimum decline on this case. So when I'm on the projections tab, I'm going to go ahead and change the D-min to 10. I'm going to change the QF to something that I can see on this page, maybe 10,000. And then I actually want to go through this little part of production. So you reservoir engineers, hold your horses. This technician's about to adjust this curve up. That's probably not right, but I don't claim to be a reservoir engineer. If you ever do any business with QED, please note, we don't have any professional engineers on our books. Everyone at QED is a reservoir engineering technician, and any curves we ever worked on or any work we did, period, would need to be reviewed by a qualified investment professional prior to using that work to make any investment decisions. And a qualified professional in our minds would be a reservoir engineer with professional engineering credentials in the state of Texas. So, I mean, just for us, that's what we would say. But I'm just for this, I'm just going to adjust this curve up. I expect Mark Bunch to give me a call after this and say this is not a very good curve. It's okay, Mark. I know if you call, it's because you love me and you want me to be better. I appreciate that. And so I'm going to make that adjustment. The point here is that when I save that, that is saving to my initials, CS. I am the qualifier that's being used because we're on the CS scenario. Now, just in terms of chain of command, I've been doing little curves like this for about, 25 years. Erin, about 10 years less than me, and Frank, about 7 years less than her. So we're probably going to trust my curves if I made a curve, even though, I'm not a reservoir engineer. We'll trust my curves probably the most. And then we would trust Erin's curves if they exist, and then we would just take Frankie's curve. So for the Aldrich L6, that's got my curve on it. But then for the top 20% of the wells, those would have curves that Erin did and curves that Frank did. And then for all the rest, they would just have projections qualified as FD, just the ones that Frankie did. So now let's set up a QED scenario that says we're going to run something, and if a forecast exists, if a projection exists that's qualified as CS, then we'll use that. But if not, check for a qualifier called ER. And if that doesn't exist, use the qualifier FD. So I'm going to go over to database settings, scenarios, and I've already kind of started this. I'll click the edit button. I've got us the scenario QED, but let's go to the qualifier tab and let's make sure that this hierarchy is what we want. See, it's not just that you have to pick one qualifier for each section. You can choose a hierarchy of qualifiers. And how this reads is, when our database is running, it would go to the first case, that Aldrich 6L, and it would say, all right, for the projections, does a qualified projection CS exist? If there's a projection that has a qualifier CS, use that. But if not, let's check the next qualifier. ER. Does this case have a projection qualified as ER? If yes, use ER. If not, let's check the next qualifier. Does this case, and so forth, and that's how it chooses for every single case. At each case, it's going to inspect for each potential input that hierarchy of qualifiers and choose what's going to be run for your scenario. Now I'm going to move over to another database that has probably a more similar workflow to what you might be used to. So I'm going to go over to the Home tab, change database, and this time I'm going to go to my Project Pinecone database. And when this comes up, I'm going to hit the drop down on the scenarios, and you might see some words that look sort of familiar to you in these scenario names. So I've got a mid-2024, a YE 2024, and a mid-2025. So what these actually were in this database. We use this database to do a mid-year evaluation at mid-year 2024. Then we use this database again to do an evaluation at year-end 2024. This summer, we did a mid-year 2025 evaluation. And now it's time for me to prepare this database to work on our year-end 2025 evaluation. So let's go over to the Database Settings tab and let's check out how these scenarios are set up. I'm going to go over to the Qualifiers tab so we can just really start at the beginning. So originally, when you establish a database, there's going to be a qualifier established as well as a scenario established called default. So if you don't do anything, everything's getting saved to the word default in a scenario called default. The first thing we did was we established a QED scenario with a QED qualifier, and this was probably before we really got cooking on this database. Things were being saved to the qualifier QED. But when we got started big time with our mid-year 2024 evaluation, we went ahead and established that qualifier MID 2024, and that became the primary qualifier for every input in the database for that mid-2024 scenario. So when it was July 1st, 2024, we input a new price deck, and that got saved to that qualifier. We input the new expenses from the LOE, and that got saved to that qualifier. We did an update to make sure all the working and revenue interests were correct, and that got saved to that qualifier. We certainly went through and updated all the forecasts, and that got saved to that qualifier. So that year, when we did our mid-year evaluation, all of the inputs got saved to these qualifiers. Then when it became year end, same thing. We went through and we input new expenses. We probably had the same fiscal models because those are your severance tax and ad val tax models. But we input all of the information, and anytime information was input, it was inputting to that new qualifier. For mid-year, same thing. Everything got input to this new qualifier, mid-year 2025. And now what I'd like us to do is I'd like us to set up our year-end 2025 in the same way. So I'm going to go back to the Settings tab and I'm going to click Edit. The great news is you can't actually copy an existing scenario. So, before you just saw me hit the plus button and type it in, but we've already got a pretty good hierarchy of qualifiers going here that I don't want to have to retype in. So let's take this mid-2025 scenario, let's right-click on it and choose Duplicate Scenario. Now I'm going to retitle that YE 2025. And then I'm going to change the report date. That needs to be 01/2026 for this particular evaluation. That looks good. I need it to be 50 years max eco life. I need it to have a primary discount rate of 10. I need it to discount 12 times per year at the end of month. Everything else looks good. So I could click save, but instead of clicking save, I'm going to go ahead over to the qualifiers tab. And now for this new scenario that we've defined, I'm going to drag and drop over a qualifier for year end 2025 for all types of inputs. Now I need to establish that new qualifier, so I'm going to hit add, and then I'm just going to type YE 2025. The qualifiers don't have to be the same name as the scenario. The qualifiers could be any alphanumeric string that you want. Again, I like to start mine with an alpha character, not a numeric character, but that's personal preference. You can start yours any way you want. And then we can just drag and drop this over to each section. And as you drag and drop it to each section, it pushes all of the existing hierarchy of qualifiers down one. So this kind of protects us. Like, what if we were in a hurry and we didn't have time to go through and do a new forecast on every single case for our year-end evaluation? Well, if it didn't find a year-end 2025 forecast, it would use the mid-year. And then if it didn't find a mid-year, it would use the year-end from last year, and so on. So the scenarios and qualifiers, this is another typical workflow that might save you some time whenever you're going through rolling databases forward. Now I'm going to go ahead and click save. And then after that saves, I'll click exit edit mode. Now remember, on the home tab, I do need to go over and flick to this new scenario. You know what I didn't do? I didn't add any cases, which I told you to do a second ago. So when I flick to this scenario, there's not going to be any cases in the case list. This happens to me, every once in a while. Oh man, the cases were in there because I copied an existing scenario. That's brilliant. If you add a new scenario, you do have to go back and do the case selection. If you copy an existing scenario, it's going to copy the case selection from the scenario that you copied. Woof! That's an extra step that we didn't even have to worry about. Let's talk about changing scenario settings. What if I was doing this evaluation for an energy lending bank, a reserves-based lending energy bank that wanted us to run the database with a primary discount rate of PV9? How do we make changes to those scenarios? Well, we click the scenario button on the database settings tab, and then we just need to remember to click edit. I'm going to go ahead and change that discount factor, that primary discount rate, from 10 to 9, and then I'll click save. And that's how we can change scenario settings. I'm going to go ahead and exit edit mode. What if we wanted to go ahead and test all these different price decks? I'm going to set up some qualifiers called flat 100, flat 90, flat 80, flat 70, flat 60, flat 50. So I would go over to the database settings tab to scenarios, and under qualifiers, make sure to click edit. We could add as many new qualifiers as we want. And I'm going to add flat 100. Man, I'm having trouble spelling today, guys. I think it's when you're on camera. I think when you're in the hot seat, it's a little bit harder to type correctly. And each time I want to add one, I'm just using a single left mouse click to hit add. I do find there's a few like nuance clicks that I tend to do when I'm clicking in PHDwin. So anytime I feel like a single click versus double click, I'll try and tell you. So that's just a single left mouse click on those plus buttons right there. And then we could potentially set up scenarios if we wanted to use all of those different qualifiers for prices. So definitely one of the things that I hope you're looking at as soon as you open a database is the scenario, which on the home ribbon is just right here on this drop down. But to make it easy for you, you might want to pin these things to your quick access toolbar. So if you go to that database settings tab, if you right click on scenarios, you can do a single left click to add to quick access toolbar. You can also right click and do show quick access toolbar in the ribbon below. And then that way, anytime you want, those scenarios and settings are just right there for you. If you need to find us, our contact information is as follows. You can call us on the phone. Our website is QEDEA.com. And if you email dreamteam@QEDEA.com, that actually goes to all of us. That goes to me, to Frankie Delgado, to Aaron Randolph, and to our Managing Director of Sales and Operations, Ashley Onyes. So if ever you needed us, if you need help today, or if you need to hire a tech, feel free to give us a call. Thanks so much for your time today, and big shout out thanks to John Smith over there at TRC Consultants. Thank you, sir, for having us again this year.